Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. I'm not the biggest fan of my original review of the Wii version of Skyward Sword, so I'm going to mostly treat this as though I'm re-reviewing Skyward Sword, as this honestly isn't that much different from the Wii version, contrary to popular belief. So let's start this out the way I usually do when I review remakes and ports, and that's talk about what's different. Perhaps one of the biggest changes is that you can now play a game entirely designed around motion controls without motion controls. Yes, you can play the entire game without having to move your controller at all. Now, this was a little bit of a learning curve at first, as the controls felt inverted and you really have to flick the right stick to get the game to register that you're swinging your sword. Otherwise, it'll just make Link kind of twirl the sword in midair, which helps with certain puzzles in the first dungeon. But after I got used to it, it managed to provide a really smooth experience. Granted, throwing bombs never did quite grow on me. I still had trouble even in the final stretches of the game, but I think this is definitely the best way to play. When I went to record this footage, I decided to use traditional motion controls, and boy did I regret it. The motion controls worked okay for the most part, but they kept having to be recalibrated when I was trying to use my slingshot. The sword controls worked fine, but I think I would prefer using the Joy-Cons, because when you want to stab, you just thrust in the right stick, whereas you have to actually make a stabbing motion with the right Joy-Con. And this never quite worked for me, especially against enemies that actually require you to stab them in order to make headway. There's also a couple of quality of life improvements, such as the game being upgraded to 60 frames per second as opposed to 30, which doesn't seem like much to the average gamer, but when you actually play side by side and have been playing Skyward Sword for as long as I have, which was 10 years now, wow, I feel old. The game feels so much smoother on the Switch. Everything is much... Well, the animations themselves haven't really changed, but they play out a lot smoother and less choppy. And overall, there's just a lot more responsiveness, and it feels a lot more like a living movie, which is what the original game was intending to be. Fi, Link's companion character, is far less annoying than she was in the original version, although that hasn't stopped her from still being annoying. Even though there are several scenes that have been trimmed, where in the original version you would have a mandatory cutscene, Fi still interrupts the action way more than I would have liked her to. So she's still annoying. If there's ever a Skyward Sword HD 2 or whatever, if they remake it again, they need to get rid of Fi even more, or better yet, reimagine the whole game so that Link has a totally different character that maybe has the personality of Midna. Finally, the last quality of life improvement I want to touch on, because there's a lot, but most of them don't really mean a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, is that there's a fast travel system in place. Now, in the original game, when you're on the surface, you would have to find an owl statue to take you back to the sky. Then, to get back to the surface, you would fly through the corresponding portal and then select the owl statue that you would want to go to. In the HD remake, if you have the Zelda and Loftwing amiibo, you can scan that after you reach a certain point in the game, and then you can create a fast travel point anywhere you want on the surface. So then you can go right to the sky from anywhere, and then as soon as you're done, just scan the amiibo again, and you'll return to their position. This is really cool, so what's the problem? It's locked behind that very specific amiibo. In fact, this game has to have some of the lamest uses of amiibo I've ever seen in a game. If you try to scan any, I repeat, any amiibo besides the Zelda and Loftwing one, Fi will not even register it as a compatible amiibo. Like, would it have killed the developers to maybe give you items and bugs? I mean, that's a big thing. You have to collect materials to upgrade your potions and your weapons, so why couldn't you have just gotten random rewards like you did in Breath of the Wild? It just feels kind of lame that you have to have one specific amiibo to lock a very convenient feature, and otherwise you have to keep going back and forth over and over again. Now let's talk about the actual game. Skyward Sword is canonically the first game in the Zelda series, so a big appeal to newcomers might be that you can experience the origins of the Master Sword, of Hyrule, of the relationship between Link and Zelda, why there are so many Links and Zeldas, a lot of your pressing questions are going to be answered here, some more directly than others, but this is definitely a much more story-based Zelda game. There's a lot of dialogue to sift through, and the characters generally don't feel entirely one-dimensional. Granted, a lot of personalities still rely on one or two specific traits, but a lot of the main central characters have very interesting character growth. Zelda in particular might be my favorite incarnation of her yet in this entry, as she feels like such a typical teenager at first, but then she really starts to grow in her responsibilities and become more adult-like as the game progresses. Link has a lot of expression. You would think he wouldn't because this game is a bit more realistic than Wind Waker, but you can still tell what he's feeling in just about every scene because his face is very realistically contorted. He even has lips, which is quite a rarity in Japanese games nowadays. And then you've got Groose, the villain, who steals every scene he's in, and even Girahim, the main villain, is starting to grow on me. Yes, he's still very creepy, and yes, he can still be a bit overdramatic, but at least it's better than the typical, I am just so evil, I'm just gonna take over the world that Ganondorf can be. I also really like how Girahim comes across as such an over-emotional wimp when you meet him, but then when you actually fight him in battle, he actually puts up a pretty good fight, and I never got tired of these fights, even if they repeated themselves way too often. Skyward Sword is a very linear Zelda game. It often doesn't pride itself very much on exploration, which is odd because the original Zelda thrived on exploration. A lot of times you'll be guided along very specific set pieces, and while this isn't necessarily a problem in itself, Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 did that, and those games were masterpieces. But Skyward Sword almost seems to go out of its way to be linear, to the point where it gets to be a bit ridiculous. And what I mean is that Skyward Sword's biggest flaw is that it seems to rely a lot on repetition and padding to make this a long experience, to make Nintendo be able to brag and say, see, this is a long Zelda game. You guys want long experiences. You don't want something short. But if it's long at the expense of new and innovative ideas, then there's a problem. Just to name a few examples, the boss battles tend to repeat themselves way too much. There are at least 2 bosses that you face 3 different times. There's another boss that I can think of that you face twice, and the second time you face the boss, you don't even get a reward. Like, why even go through all of that? The context is that you're searching for something, but why can't you just have it so that instead of searching in that particular area, cut it all together, or at the very least, if you have to have that gauntlet, then give the player something, like a reward or a new item. As it is, this HD remake is more or less a faithful retreading of the original Skyward Sword. Everything that you look forward to if you were one of the people that liked Skyward Sword is all here. You still get to do those magnificent silent realms. You still have the sweeping orchestral score that's majestic, but all the parts that you dread are also here as well. You still have to go through the same 3 areas that aren't connected in the slightest. You still have long, drawn-out cutscenes, though at least you can skip most of them. For some odd reason, they didn't go all the way and let you skip every single one of them. But Skyward Sword is a lot better of a game than I originally was allowed to give credit, because when I first played it, I was with my 2 brothers, and those 2 are very opinionated and often force me to believe them whether I want to or not. When I played Skyward Sword again for the HD release, I really liked the contrast between the world of Skyloft and the world of the surface. The surface is full of enemies and puzzles, and the enemies themselves are really well programmed. A lot of times you have to think very carefully about where you're moving your sword in 3D space to account for the enemy's movement. And I believe the developers even reprogrammed a lot of them so that the enemies could still adequately dodge even if you're not using the motion controls. The sky itself is very boring to traverse, though. Skyloft, to differentiate from the sky, Skyloft is a piece of land that acts as your hub world, or the Peach's Castle of this game. It's a very peaceful village in the sky, and that's where you do all of your shopping and side quests, and that's where you meet the majority of the characters. Skyloft is a good set piece, and I really like the contrast between the crazy world of the surface. However, it's once you jump off of the ledge and get onto your bird that things get a bit boring. The bird moves a little bit too slow for my likings, and you'll only have 3 speed boosts before you have to wait for it to recharge. Now, if you're not playing with motion controls, it's great that you can just use the control stick and buttons to move the bird. But when you are, you have to tilt the Joy-Con just to move the bird, and you have to slash the Joy-Con downward to make the bird flap its wings, which was annoying in the Wii version, and it's even more annoying here considering that you don't need them when you're playing in non-motion controls, so why not have that an option when you are playing with detached Joy-Cons? To have the option to move the bird with the control stick. Why wasn't that a possibility in the Wii version, for that matter? Thankfully, once you descend into the surface, most of the time the game is a lot of fun. When the game's not repeating its concepts over and over again and making you refight a boss and returning to an area for some arbitrary reasons. One of the dungeons even repeats itself, for crying out loud. And even though the game tries to say, but, you can explore new areas now, it doesn't excuse the fact that I kind of miss the open, connected worlds of games like Breath of the Wild, and even Twilight Princess, which was actually the reason for why the game was so segmented. The developer said that they thought the world of Twilight Princess was too big and confusing, so they wanted to condense it. Well, they quickly changed their mind with Breath of the Wild, because if that world isn't big and confusing, I don't know what is. Maybe Skyrim? Overall, I think Skyward Sword gets a lot more hate than I think it really deserves. Yes, it's repetitious. Yes, Fi is really annoying. And yes, sometimes the enemy variety is a bit lacking. But I do think that this game has a lot of really fun and unique challenges, and a lot of things that people praise in games like Breath of the Wild and the Link's Awakening remix actually started out with Skyward Sword. This was the first one to have the stamina gauge. Skyloft is a really cool hub world idea, and I'm really surprised that hasn't made its way into more Zelda games by now. And overall, once you get to places like the Silent Realms and some of the later dungeons, you're in for some really creative puzzles. And yes, just in case you forgot, this game has traditional Zelda dungeons. There aren't as many as what you would expect in games like Ocarina of Time, but all of the dungeons are tightly crafted and actually don't repeat themselves. Each dungeon feels very fresh, and even if the dungeon's theming repeats itself, the puzzles in the dungeons are fresh and new. So you don't have to worry about any repetition there, except maybe a little bit in the final one, but that's kind of the point, as you'll see once you get there. So I think you should give Skyward Sword a try. I don't think you should play it with the motion controls, as that was the main reason a lot of people hated it, and when I played with them again, I could not see myself playing this all the way through with them, and wondered how I ever survived on the Wii, which had a sensor bar, compared to this, which doesn't, and only used gyro controls, which in some instances made it worse. However, I think that if you already own Skyward Sword and you're totally okay with the motion controls, there's really no reason to double dip. Everything is just about exactly the same, with a few quality of life improvements. There's no new areas, there's no new items, no new characters, not even a new credits scene. And, not even worse, they actually removed the Ballad of the Goddess trailer theme if you wait long enough on the title screen. So in a manner of speaking, this game actually has less content than the Wii version did. So, if you're new to Skyward Sword, I definitely think this is the version you should try, as it's so much more convenient and the Joy-Cons don't eat up nearly as much batteries as the Wii Remote did. If you already have Skyward Sword, you can probably skip this, but if you already owned it but didn't finish it, I think you should give it another try on the Switch. So with that, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, or if I left out anything, please let me know in the comment section, and until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and Nintendo, next time you design a game around motion controls, maybe have a backup plan next time. Bye!